So it's a bit echoey.
Sorry, the other laptop was on. It's off now, I think.
Better.
Yeah. The moment that a regime has destroyed thousands of lives and continues to have control over people's lives at the moment, we believe that we should be able to force people to give their DNA because we think that it is simply principally just, but also leads to more accountability on our side of the house. We think that at the moment that you have circumstances in your birth that lead to decisions later in life, that does not absolve you from all moral culpability, right? For example, if you have an abusive parent, that may lead you later to normalized cycles of abuse. However, we do not say that that is okay to do just because of the circumstances of your birth. In the same way, obviously, we completely regret that this happened to these children. It was not their fault, and it is not their fault that this happened to them. However, if you later in life, as one of these children, continue to absolve your parents of blame because you do not want to see them in jail, because you do not want to destroy the relationship with them, we think it is your moral duty to actually undergo this DNA test. Therefore, we think that as a state, we should be able to force you to do so. First of all, on accountability and scrutiny, and then a little bit on that principle. On recognition and why it's so important. So accountability. Note the context of this debate, right? During the kidnappings that happened under the junta, what very often happened is that these children were then given to a clarification, okay?
Yeah. Kun je uitzetten? Are you also going to force these children to meet these parents?
No, not necessarily. I don't see why we would do that. We think this is mostly about accountability, holding the people who kept these children in the first place part of the regime to account. We don't think we have to force them to meet their own parents. That doesn't seem necessary. Okay, accountability and public scrutiny. During these kidnappings, a lot of these children were forced, kidnapped, and then given to individuals within that regime, right? Very often what happened was that they were taken away from these parents, and then, for example, higher officials within this regime, people with money, people with privilege, then took these children in and raised them as their own, right? This was to prevent people from finding out that these children were actually stolen, but also to create ties between these children and between these parents in order to keep the regime alive, right? We say that means that a lot of these, because of the fact that this regime was so incredibly untransparent, and because of the lack of public scrutiny, both within Argentina, but also within the international community, a lot of these individuals still hold positions of immense power, right? Look at, for example, even the Queen of the Netherlands, her father was a huge part of the regime in Argentina, and that only came to light like about 10 years ago, and it was a huge scandal. But until that time, it took, like, he still controlled a lot of privilege and that kind of stuff, right? So we say that is incredibly bad. What we think is more important is that we hold these individuals to account, mostly because they also occupy political positions, but also important financial positions. Okay, what do we do then? At the moment that you do not force a DNA test, what happens is that these children do not want to rat out their parents to the police, right? That's very logical. You love your parents, you do not want to see them in jail, but also you're probably incredibly afraid of fracturing the relationship with a person who has so much power and who has so much privilege within that system, right? We say at the moment that we force them to undergo this DNA test, that is the moment that we actually get the information saying this person was not this person's child. We are already strongly suspected them and have evidence, but it is all, for example, circumstantial about the fact that they were children of other parents. We say at the moment that we do this, we are able to say these people were very likely part of the regime. These people were very likely people who took in these children and actually did that, right? Also note, second of all, at the moment that we force these people to do this as the government, this child no longer has the feeling that they rat their parents out. They no longer have the feeling that they are the reason that their parents went to jail, because it is not their fault, right? They were forced to undertake this DNA test. We think very often, because this discussion has been going on for so long in Argentina about the suspicions of who were part of this regime, children already have suspicions about their parents, right? They already believe that there is a chance that those parents could be part of that regime and could be guilty of that, right? But because of the strong ties that they have with their family and because of the strong emotional bond that they have to them, they do not come forward and they are afraid to, right? We say that there is a second group who might want to come forward very much, but feel afraid, for example, to do so because they would be blamed by their entire family, by their parents. We say offering this group the ability to do that by sort of taking the blame as the government is incredibly important, because we say we prioritize this second group who would have wanted to come forward because they have zero choice in the status quo, right? We say on their side of the house, people have the choice to come forward very often, but they simply do not do so because they believe it is not their responsibility to hold their parents to account. So why is that accountability so important? We say for two reasons. First of all, for recognition of the parents whose children were stolen under the regime, but second of all, we say because of awareness around this subject leads to the ability to be able to do something, right? Through the political process, for example, when it becomes clear which individuals were actually guilty of doing this, that means you are very much more likely as a public, for example, to be able to vote certain people out or to be able to vote on processes that keep these people out of power. But second of all, on possible compensation, right? At the moment that you, for example, know as a child you've undertaken this DNA test, I am not this person's child. If you didn't know, you're much more likely, for example, to go looking for your parents, which means that compensation is much more likely and you can be reunited with them. But second of all, we say that compensation is simply more possible because parents can come forward and, for example, say, I think I am your father, I think I am your mother, therefore they are more likely to get that compensation, right? But third of all, we say people are much more likely to be able to tell their stories and tell what happened, and that is much more likely to be taken seriously at the moment that we know that we have proof, right? Because in the status quo, people don't want to believe, for example, that certain political leaders are guilty because, for example, they might be very good for the economy and they might be thinking of excuses, right? We say that no longer happens on our side of the house. We get that recognition, a POI from opening opposition.
Why do you assume that any person that simply doesn't oppose the regime and wants to give a child the best possible life is directly responsible for the kidnapping?
Right. Look, that's not at the moment that you know, as a part of the regime in a privileged position, that that children are being kidnapped, and you simply want to give them a better life by actively taking these children in and then hiding it for years that these people, because note, right, the only reason we have to force this DNA test is because in the status quo, these parents are still not coming forward, are still not saying that these took these children in, and are still not willing to admit that these children were stolen, right? Why? Because they know that that will give actual evidence and actual more proof of the fact that they were probably part of that regime, and that is going to lead to a larger investigation, which right now probably public attorneys within the government don't have actual, what do you call it again? Causal a reason to do that. At the moment that you have a very strong reason, for example, to get a warrant to search these people's records, to search into their history, to be able to interrogate them, that is when the shitstorm comes down upon them, right? They don't want them that to happen, and that is why they don't allow these DNA tests to happen. At the moment that you were an innocent person who simply adopted a random child via the adoption system, you would have absolutely no problem, beyond then maybe some emotional things, with saying, yeah, maybe they have a different parent. Like, look at, for example, normal adoption parents in Western societies and other societies. Like, they're usually fine with allowing their children to get, for example, one of those tests because of the fact that they know, I love my child, I am their real parent. Finding their real parent isn't that bad of a thing. So we say that is the reason these things aren't happening. That is the context we are talking about. We have to hold these individuals to account, therefore vote opening government.
Woo! I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the leader of the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, for technical reasons, I'm going to use Miri's laptop because my internet is kind of... okay, just a second. Good. Panel, I will have 3 points of rebuttal and then 3 points of substantive. Firstly, on the biological parents. Secondly, on the agency of the children we are talking about. And lastly, on the sort of given parents or adoptive parents, whatever you want to call them. First, therefore, the 3 points of rebuttal. Okay, one, just to be very clear about this, the regime is not in power anymore, to the extent that they therefore say the regime has still control over your lives. That is not entirely true, because we think these people have agency now that they are grown-ups. Something that the regime has done has shaped your life. That doesn't mean that it controls every aspect of your life, especially at the point at which you have grown up under basically normal circumstances. Okay, second point of rebuttal. They say these parents have been higher officials in the regime. We say in many, many cases, this is not true. Oftentimes they haven't been higher officials, but just like not acting against the regime. Secondly, we tell you that it's untrue that these people are still in power in Argentina today. Why is that the case? Because there have been court cases excluding these people from public office, which is rather unique. It happened in Argentina, and also which passed many life sentences to these people, even people who didn't actively commit, I don't know, murders, etc., but people in the administration, sort of the paper thing. Okay. So we think, by the way, the claim of the innocent parents will love the children, like obviously they will still have the emotional harms. Also, we think even guilty or complicit parents probably also loved their children. So we don't see how this falls out of the debate. Lastly, about the moral duty these people have, we think the children don't have a moral duty at the point at which what they could, the parents could get back is a memory, but not a real thing. You cannot give them back a baby or a small child. That is to say, we think the agency of an adult person to have not to have their life wrecked is more important. Okay. Just one further, not at this point, one further point just to clarify things. We are very happy to provide and facilitate all the support possible for everyone who wishes to have these DNA tests made. Therefore, we don't think it is a massive delta in this debate when OG claims that there is going to be pressure on these people not to make the DNA test. We are going to facilitate it with everything we have. We just don't force you to do it. If you want, go for it. Okay, first point of substantive, what happens to the biological parents? A couple of things. Obviously, right now they have been protesting on a regular basis because they want something back. The problem is the thing they want back is something we cannot actually restitute to them because they want back the following things. One, they want back the ability to have their child. Two, the ability to raise their child, and three, therefore, the ability to establish a bond and relationship with their child, which is a kind of bond and relationship you can only establish with a toddler or a child, not with a stranger who is a grown-up, even if they had been related to you. Okay. B, we tell you, like I just said, you cannot have that kind of relationship with a 40-year-old stranger at the point at which that is true. We think your claim on having that relationship is less important than the life of that 40-year-old stranger. C, we tell you, sure, say even if all that happens, you might be happy initially because you're sort of reconnected to your child. However, this happiness is only going to last for a short while. Why? Firstly, because then the harm is even greater because you realize, oh, look, this child is a stranger to me. They're very different from me. Maybe like that means you're unlikely to establish a bond to you. But further, even if you happen to establish a bond, and you know that somehow works out, which we think oftentimes it won't, this is going to be a constant painful reminder of what could have been. That is to say, this you want to get something back that we cannot give you back, literally. D, that means further, in some cases, we think in many cases, you won't get along with them. Why? Because they have been raised in a, like they're probably ideologically very different from you. They're probably going to be angry about you because you haven't fought hard enough, because you prioritized your ideology over raising your kid. So if they're reconnected to you, these are going to be things that make them angry. Further, simply the point that they have been forced to do that and didn't have a choice in that. Does closing have any POI?
So not knowing where your child is or what happened to them, or if they're even alive, is far worse than not having a productive relationship with them 40 years later.
So for the reasons of how bad this relationship is often going to be, we disagree. We secondly disagree because oftentimes you're not going to find your child anyway. And we thirdly disagree because of what I've just said, that this is just less important than the agency and life of the child. Let's move therefore into why that harms the child and its identity. Okay, we think in terms of how it harms the child and why that is more important, it harms the identity because it for a couple of reasons. One, it disrupts literally who you thought you were and everything you thought about the world. Two, the delta is forced on you. That means two things. One, you probably hate it because you haven't had a choice, and you resent it. You're put into the shoes of a child because yes, parents can decide over a toddler, but not over a grown-up. You're sort of belittled. B, we tell you some tests will be negative, which will create an even larger harm because you have doubted everything, although it's not true. C, even if some people will doubt in the status quo, that won't outweigh the harms to individuals that are forced. We are happy if you doubt it and you want to know, go for the test. Okay, thirdly and lastly, what happens to about the given parents? Like some of them were complicit in crimes. they spent, however, the last 30 or 40 years raising and loving these kids, and are probably now either dead or in their 80s and 90s. That means they are now in the A. That means they're now in a part of their lives where they particularly rely on these children. For one, the social net, because oftentimes if you're in old age, you need your kids to be your social relationships. We think that now this will turn your kids against you, even though oftentimes you're probably not going the person that has been harmed harming them, because oftentimes, even though you somewhat have been complicit, you probably still prioritized the happiness of that kid over the other things. Okay. Oh, sorry, out of time. Thank you.
Woo. I would like to thank the speaker and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mic check, can you hear me?
Yes, still a bit echoey. Can you repeat?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Cool, let me just set up my timer. Two things before I start my speech. One, if you want to give me POIs, give them verbally. I'm not going to be looking at the chat. I will also give 2 opportunities at least for POIs, one around 4, one around 5 minutes. So you can just wait for these. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. This debate has one major trade-off upon which we're going to win. Basically, the best thing that opposition can claim, at least opening opposition, is, oh, this is going to ruin relationships between parents and children. One, we're going to tell you why this is a very weak priority, but two, we're going to tell you why, in terms of the quality of life these people have, especially the justice that needs to be done to these people, we have a significantly higher burden. One thing at a time. One, notice they completely ignore all the contextualization that America gives you. Sebastian, you're from South America. You know very well what happens to corrupt fucking governments, especially ones that were operated by military, and the structures they leave behind. Even if the people on the top of the structure are removed, executed, etc., what happens frequently is that the people within the structure, especially the administrative ladders, especially secretary positions of like positions that are not really in the public eye, frequently remain. This is extremely similar. This is extremely similar to what would have happened in Germany had it not been for the Nuremberg trials to go deep in and dive and examine exactly who was responsible. Such things did not happen in Argentina, did not happen in South America in general, because there was no large-scale international scrutiny when these regimes fell. They largely fell due to internal pressures as opposed to external pressures. What does this mean? One, this means that a lot of very, very guilty people are still in power. Second, understand there's very little seeking of accountability, especially because notice that the conflict, that the period during which this happened was also the period during which Argentina was fighting against the UK for the Falkland Islands. Nationalism was rampant. There was very little internal scrutiny from the population, but also, the general issues of the population were probably not on digging out particularly corrupt individuals. What does this mean? One, a lot of these people who are responsible for a literal crime against humanity are running free out there. This is like the biggest depth of injustice you can possibly do towards the parents. But I'm going to impact on that one thing at a time. One, why we have the highest burden towards fulfilling justice towards the parents whose children were taken away. A couple of things. One, understand that whenever we're talking about justice, it is giving each and everybody what is their due. If something is taken away, then it is justice for you to receive that back, as well as it's justice for the perpetrator to be punished for causing you the harm. So what is taken away from these parents? 4 things. One, their loved ones. Clearly, no thank you. One, their loved ones. The point at which having a child, somebody to who you've dedicated a lifetime of preparation, somebody who literally willed into existence, is a massive commitment, especially for people who we believe are ideologically strong, right? I'm going to talk about this in 20 seconds exactly. But literally taking away one of the most dear things to you is fundamentally unjust. At the point at which we're the only ones who get us one step closer to giving at least some degree of retribution to these parents, to letting them at least know that their child is alive, or letting them know that at least, even if their particular child is not alive, even if they don't know the specific details of their child, they know that in general, the people in similar circumstances are receiving justice. That they as a group of political dissidents are not left behind in history to rot and treated as second-hand citizens. The second thing that is extremely important is that those people were silenced politically, right? This means specifically, this policy was specifically done in order to make sure that their political ideology is, one, shut down during their own lifetimes, but two, is not passed onwards. That there are no children of political dissidents who can keep on spreading this in the future generations. And this leads me to my third point, right? You can do very little to reestablish this political relevance mechanisms unless you do something radical, unless you reignite the public consciousness, and this is the only way to achieve this. But finally, I think this is the most crucial thing. These people are denied their legacies. And I think this is really, really impactful. Why? Because your legacy is the only immortal thing a human being can achieve. It is literally the one thing that keeps on persisting after your death. At the point at which your legacy is taken away in the form of your political ideas are erased, your children, the only way for you to create this legacy for most conventional human beings, is taken away, and that is erased, is sent to a re-education society in some rich hacks family, then this is an injustice that is fundamentally crucial to you. Because we correct these injustices directly, because we compensate and return those types of injustices to these people, then we fulfill the burden towards justice. So how do we do that? Not now. How do you do that? One, accountability. Marika already does a pretty substantial job. Zero engagement with that. So I'm expecting quite a lot from the DOO and from closing up. Let's see what they do about that. But there's a couple of mechanisms. One, direct accountability. And the point at which you do learn that you're a stolen child, a couple of mechanisms kick in. One, you're probably going to be asking your parents about what the fuck happened. Why have they never told you that you're abandoned? What were their political stances, etc. This means two things. One, significantly more pressure for these people to reveal the truth, right? Especially when numerous cases around them are also revealing that there's an active risk of, if they don't reveal things, they don't tell you exactly what happened, then they can be legally culpable. Then they can ruin their relationship with you. You will never ever trust them again if you're faulty. But second of all, there's a lot of guilt pressuring that individuals can exert upon their parents. At the point at which you know that you can no longer hide this, that there's no safety mechanism, then the guilt of lying to this child for their entire life kicks in. This means a couple of things. One, you're simply more likely to reveal a lot of the information, specifically in terms of learning how these people got their parents, which is likely to lead us to the exact people in power who are responsible. This is how we achieve the first degree of accountability. But second of all, significantly more substantial, like material evidence, is likely to emerge. This means that all trials are likely to be reignited, which means that we can now put these people to charge in front of a criminal system and get rid of them and, again, achieve justice. I'll take closing now.
So Julio Pog is being prosecuted because he did the death flights, which threw people who were dissidents out of the flights. People like Zoragida can never get into power. I think it's a lie when you say there's no
thank you. There's a difference. Again, there's a huge difference between the people who you elect and the people who are left over within the entire structure. The people who are on non-elected appointed positions who you were just never busy enough to get rid of. Those are the cancers within society that were just as responsible for the systematic disenfranchisement victims receive. Finally, on agency of children, I think there's a very important symbol you need to understand, right? At the point at which these children were taken away, they were denied agency in a really fundamental way. This is very similar to radicalize religious indoctrination, at which point your entire perception, because you were raised in a completely different society by completely different individuals, is taken away. This is the absolute ultimate way of taking of agency. We would draw similarities to literally being born blind, and a point at which we as a society have the ability to restore your sight or to give you sight, even if there is some degree of negative harm that could possibly harm. For example, you might, suffer from witnessing all the suffering of the people near you. Now, visually, we believe that you still have a justice to restore this agency to these people, even if they, end up hurting themselves with it. Again, we do this already to religious fanatics, but we also do it to drug addicts, right? People who we know cannot make these decisions on their own because they lack information or because they lack the fundamental wiring within their head that is caused by being indoctrinated for an entire lifetime of being raised within a privileged household. At the end of the day, we shift the social discourse around this issue. This is the only way we can, one, fulfill the highest burden towards the people who are hurt the most, as opposed to closing up who are just telling us, oh, but they're not going to be happy. No, it doesn't matter if they're happy. Most of them probably will be happy because of how fundamental knowing the ones you cared about, literally the most important contribution you had towards your life, continues living on in some other form. So whether or not they're happy, it doesn't matter. But the most fundamental thing is we give them back what was taken away from them. This is why opening government definitively takes this debate.
Woo. I would like to thank the speaker and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition.
Can I just check that my audio is fine?
Yes.
Great. And I would never dare to stand behind you and try to claim that what was done is anything but the worst of atrocities, and that if we could have prevented it or could have stopped it or could have redressed it at some point in the past, anyone who had the power to do that probably should have. What we are telling you is that the actors you would be punishing are not the right actors to punish. Just because you want revenge on some people doesn't mean you can get revenge on any people that weren't harmed as much as others. Secondly, we are telling you, and by the way, this goes unresponded to, right? What Indo tells you is that you can't restore justice or agency because those aren't kids. Like if you're bad at math like me and put this into a calculator, you will realize that those children are now at least 37 to 44, assuming they were born on the day that they were relocated, right? Those are people in their 40s and 50s. You cannot restore the agency of a parent who lost the ability to raise a child by telling them, there's the 50-year-old person that would have been your son, right? But also, lastly, what we are telling you is that you are harming innocent, no longer children, now a whole generation raising their own children for absolutely no massive benefit. I will expand a bit on the shattered sense of identity and impact to you exactly why that is the worst possible thing you can do these children that are, after all, still a victim. But before that, a lot of rebuttal. OG says that positions might still be given out on corruption, even if the children of people who were in power 40 years ago still get positions because their parents were powerful in that regime. I am pretty sure they will manage to evade responsibility for their parents. And it's unclear why, because you can tell which children are the ones that were kidnapped and given to which families. You can also tell who took them, right? Because it's not the parents directly who did it. But also, just on the idea that, oh, the parents will now confess everything because they're scared. Like, how will you know who lies and who doesn't, right? Even if they tell you everything. Is a story implausible if they can't remember a name and a face, like a real name that you can tie to a real person? Because if they had a fake name, then I guess that they're bad, right? That you can tie to a real human after 40 or 50 years. There are clearly no records you can go on, because if there were records, you could just use those instead of using this policy, right? But also, just the idea that no, please put POIs in the chat. Just because you don't respect the rules doesn't mean I don't. But also, just on the idea that you denied those parents the legacy. One, you did that, you cannot change that. But two, I'm unsure why giving them children that probably have very different political affiliation of their own, very different life experiences, very different preferences, and calling them their legacy and making them responsible for them as their legacy makes anything better. But, okay, 2 more points of rebuttal. One, on the idea of moral responsibility. One, I don't think that the argument is true, right? Harm was done onto you as a child that was transferred as well. You are a victim. Just because you might have the power to expose some people that might have been complicit, it doesn't mean you need to inquire even more personal harm to do it. But two, even if you have the moral responsibility to do so, that doesn't automatically mean that the state should force you to do that, right? You probably have a moral responsibility as living in the Netherlands to donate to all victims of past colonialism of the Netherlands. I don't think your government is forcing you to do that. But lastly, and this really gets to me, panel, on the idea that, you know, the parents that took those children in were comfortable, were privileged, they are at fault, they should be punished. I know this is tough to wrap your mind around, right? But the problem is that people who live under a dictatorship as severe as one that would literally take your children away if you disobey, does not have a population you can put into a binary good victim or plain evil, right? There might have been people among them who opposed the regime, but were afraid. They were afraid their own children would be taken. They were afraid they would be thrown in jail. Do you really think that they are responsible for the atrocities just because they weren't courageous enough to put their own lives at stake to oppose them? I don't think so, right? But secondly, I think there might have probably also been a lot of them within that regime that might not have agreed with the regime, but that actually thought that if they are the ones that take in those children, rather than them going to more extremist families or going to families that might abuse them, that is something that is good for their child. Just because opening government doesn't thinks that that's worse than them having stayed with their children, I agree with you, but tough luck. That is not the comparative in this debate, and that is definitely not an option that the parents take, like the actual parents taking in children and trying to give them a good life were making, right? It was not their decision on whether those children get taken away or not, right? Panel, when you live under a sense of dictatorship, yes, it is morally right for you to oppose it, but at what personal cost, right? I was raised by someone who spent their whole life opposing the dictatorship in Romania, and they don't have the ability to fight against anything because their whole lives has been ruined by the fact that they were opposed and prosecuted every step. The fact that you wouldn't choose to opt into it as a human being is not something that makes you evil. It's something that makes you normal. I will take a POI from closing. Okay, opening.
As a government and as a prosecution, you need probable cause to be able to actually investigate people who might have done bad stuff. These people were already complicit. This is a way to prove that they were also actively engaging in that regime, and this is the only mechanism we have to do
When I
so.
say thank you, who do you prosecute? Prove the link that the parents that took those children in are directly culpable for the kidnappings, right? Prove the fact that the people who kidnapped the children are still alive. Prove the fact that there are still people that whatever link you might be able to establish is actually real, rather than someone who did a good job at doctoring records and covering their tracks, right? This happened 50 years ago. I genuinely don't think you manage to punish anyone. And even if you do, I'm not sure you will be able to know that you punish the right people. But let's look at what happens with these people now in their 40s and 50s, right? Because you shattered their whole sense of identity. Because you build who you are and who you think of as yourself, your preferences, around a lot of things that all start in childhood, like the experiences you have that are explained to you by your parents, right? Values of which authorities you respect, what is good or bad, what kind of relationships you want, how do you love someone, who should you trust. There are all things that are influenced by your parents because you model yourself around what your parents approve of and disapprove of, right? We are now suddenly trying to tell those children that, like those humans, that their parents were absolute monsters and absolute evil because that's what OG thinks, right? Those people have collected a sum of all the things those evil parents have told them and built who they are and what they value around it, right? Now they have to question if they're a monster for loving their parents, if they're a monster if they don't want to meet strangers, should they resent their biological parents for not fighting harder? Is everything they have ever done in their life good or bad? Panel, I don't think that shattering everything someone knows about themselves at the age of 50 is a harm that is worth anything. We should not force anyone who doesn't want to take this DNA test. Proto pose.
Woo! I would like to thank the speaker and call upon the member of government.
I think that the opening government kind of misses the point of this debate. They don't necessarily link it with the forcibly doing this to people, because they link it to the small benefit, which is, but you're going to hold your parents accountable, which I'm not necessarily entirely sure this is true, because you still live with these people for like 40 years, you still love them, you still have a bond with them and anything else. I don't think that's the necessary benefit. But we say that force is something that is fine if the information that you're going to get is the truth that is so much more important, even if it comes to forcing people, right? That is to say, for two reasons. Firstly, because of these people who are denied identity and denied the truth, but secondly, because literally what's happening in these regimes were terrible, terrible criminal acts which would need to be exposed, which is literally human trafficking, and we don't care if this if some people are forced to do some sorts of these kinds of things. The second thing I also want to point out on opening government, you know, they're generally right, is they talk about parents and stuff, but we don't necessarily see if the state like has a gene pool and they're going to necessarily link you with your real father and how this is going to work. I don't think this works that way. I don't think the parents are included into this debate. So two things in this speech then. Why do we firstly think that information is very important for these people? Notice that these regimes were literally denying the identity and denying the truth to these people. That is to say, they didn't tell them who they are, who their parents were, and everything else. So why is this important? Because they were denied the truth per se. It doesn't necessarily mean that this truth is important to these people or that these people would like to know the truth. It's important to know the truth per se, right? Because when you know the truth, then you know more real information. Hence, you're much more likely to get a better decision. This is something that the state has taken away from you and now has a moral obligation to give it back to you. But why do we think that forcibly doing this is something that is fine? Because without the force, a lot of people, so you can like still give the people opportunity to do these things, but a lot of people will choose to opt out and not do these things, right? Firstly, because you're afraid to generally get the truth, because this might completely shatter your idea of your entire livelihood, but also because you don't necessarily think that there is a big chance of you actually being a stolen child, right? So that is to say, because of stupid reasons, biases that are cognitive and emotional reasons that exist deep within us, we are denying ourselves the truth about us, right? That is to say, a lot of people are scared to go to the doctor, for example, because they're scared the doctor is going to tell them that they're actually sick. That is to say, our own cognitive and emotional biases that are deep within us are denying us the truth about us. That is why the state needs to coerce you and force you into doing these things, because otherwise you wouldn't have the truth. Why do we value the truth so much? Because then we think that you can actually make a valuable decisions about your life and your livelihood, right? We don't necessarily have to prove that this information is important to you. A lot of people will not change the way they live or anything else, but we still think that the truth per se is a valuable thing, no matter how you will use that truth in general. Is intuition pump for you, right? A lot of people don't want to educate themselves, right? But we still think that the state should force people to go to school because the information they get there are important for the decision-making process that happens later, right? We think that when you have more information, you have a more informed choice. Because lots of people will not decide to do these things, because of a lot of people will choose not to do these things, we think that the only way to pressure them into having more information, hence regaining control of their life, is through doing this, right? But the second thing I want to talk about is why this is very important, just as a principle thing, because notice what happened in these situations. It's not just taking away a child from one family and putting it into another. This is quite literally the definition of human trafficking. You're stealing children from their families and giving it to someone else. This is literally a criminal definition of human trafficking. So given that, we think that the state has an obligation to find out more and more information about these things and expose these things. This doesn't necessarily have to be connected to holding someone accountable and all any of these things, right? But in a criminal system, we live in a criminal system which we value information and we want to know more about things that happen, even if they don't necessarily lead to anything specific happening, right? We think that in a situation in which the state knows that human trafficking was happening, it has an obligation to uncover as many information as possible. This is also something that already exists in an existing criminal system. So whenever you have a doubt that a criminal act has happened, for example, murder or something, you do have a right to force people to give away DNA, to talk about like what happened and everything else. So this is something that is like already existing in the status quo, right? So this is not necessarily connected to the very prosecution, right? Even though we think the prosecution will happen after all of these things, we think that whenever something that is so major as literal human trafficking happened, we think that the state has an obligation to find out as many information as possible. This is the only way the state can have any proof that this happened, who did it, and who were the victims of this, who were the parents that was this taken away from, who are these children and everything else. Whenever they have a chance to do this, we think that they should. And this is where force takes into place. We think that even with forcing these people, this is something that is absolutely fine, because then you uncover the truth that is much more important, because it is important to a generally a much broader audience, and is general something that we value more than just forcing you to do a DNA test and give away sample of your blood and everything else. Before I go on, I'll take opening, for example. Opening, hello.
Just because something about you might be factually true, why is that your identity more than what you have believed to be true for 40 years?
Because everything else is basically a lie. You can believe that, I don't know, the Santa Claus exists. That doesn't mean that is the truth, right? So we think that whenever a state has the option to give you a rightful truth that is really factually true, they do have an obligation to give you this truth, even though this might coerce you, even though you don't like it, even though you don't necessarily need it. That's onto our first point, right? But onto our second point, which this POI has nothing to do with. So even if that doesn't necessarily lead to prosecution of people, we think that the things that were done were so terrible that we need information to uncover as many things as possible and then tell people as much information as possible. Otherwise, we think that if the state is not doing this, it's literally hiding the information from the people, which is contrary of what the state is should be doing, considering that it should be protecting its people and giving them as many information as possible, because they have a mechanism to tell you as much as they can, that they decide to be silent about it. The only way you can do these things is through forcing people to do this. But I also think that people who are liable for this should be accountable, not necessarily because, as the opening says, they were part of the regime, but because they did so much terrible things. There's literal human trafficking, which is one of the worst crimes in existence in the entire world, right? But even if they are not prosecuted in the end of the day, we do think that we have an obligation as a system to give people as many information as possible. The only way to do this is to force people, and are willing to take the trade-off of forcing people if we're going to have more information about you and about this terrible thing that happened. For these reasons proposed.
Woo!